Hey all, it's Matt, your average gamer, and for this video we're going to be doing a little bit of a study of the Rivers of Blood, and at the end of the video we're going to be showing off a rune level 150 build for the weapon itself. The question I want to answer today via much testing, several different testing that we're going to be doing, and it's going to involve the Nagakiba with double slash starting katana with double slash Rivers of Blood. We're going to test everything and find out whether the Rivers of Blood is still overpowered and whether or not the weapon itself is now obsolete. First things first, we're going to test it at Gatefront. We're going to see how much damage at rune level 150 the Rivers of Blood does in comparison to the Nagakiba build in Keen Affinity with double slash and Blood Flame Blade at rune level 150. Keep in mind all bosses and enemies have different resistances, so we're going to test on different bosses and enemies in the game to get a better idea. Now we're going to be moving on to the Nagakiba. Note the first two hits on the Rivers of Blood gave us 799 damage. And be sure to note as we have the second strike here to see how much damage that does in comparison. 1052 damage compared to the 799 we got from the Rivers of Blood. Now we're going to do the same thing with the troll testing at Secluded Cell. Here with the entire Ash of War we got around 54-57. I wasn't sure every hit landed, so I ended up doing this a second time. Keep in mind all the testing for this video is for PvE only, as PvP has an entirely different, well, basically all the weapons for PvP that are good are not necessarily good in PvE and vice versa. Some of them are, but most of them are very different. Now here on the second hits, we end up with a total of 6165. I believe that was the full animation of the Ash of War. And in a second here, 6165 was the max damage we're able to get. I'm going to show off the Nagakiba in Keen Affinity and see how much damage we get with this. And now we're going to roll, as we mentioned, with the Nagakiba in Keen Affinity with Blood Flame Blade. We're just using your tier for both builds, no additional buffs on this one, and we're going to see how much damage we get. And the amount of damage we get in total here ends up being 6370, which is around 200 and something more damage than the Rivers of Blood. Now keep in mind, Keen Affinity allows us to have a lot more dexterity, and we're going to scale really high with that. But that being said, for a lot of people that cap their builds around 125 and 150 like myself, it's good to know which is better and which gives us more room with our stats. And the answer is double slash on the Nagakiba is better for both. It's good to know that at Gatefront and on the Troll, soon and short here we're going to do some dragon testing as well to see which one is better, but so far it looks like double slash is the better of the two when comparing it to the Rivers of Blood. And now we're going to jump immediately right here into hitting the dragon and then going from here to see how quickly we can take these dragons down with the Rivers of Blood. After this, we're going to test the same thing with the Keen Nagakiba to see how fast they go down with that build as well. And now dragons are slash resistant, so it's a little bit of a difficult boss to face, and they all have decent bleed resistance too, but it was something else to try it on. Keep in mind I tried this on many different enemies in the game to give myself a good idea of how well it works, spending several hours testing both. And we're going to end up moving on to the second dragon here. We're doing a decent amount of damage with 45 dexterity and 45 arcane, but overall it is taking a little bit to take both these dragons down. And keep in mind, both these builds are going to have similar setups, but the damage itself so far at rune level 150, especially since we have to have split damage, is not the best. So far with the dragons, they're actually giving me a little bit harder time than I would have expected. At the end of the day, though, I believe we end up taking both dragons down in just over a minute. It was probably about a minute and 4 seconds in total when using the Rivers of Blood, and I tested this multiple times and got around the same time each time. Now we're going to try the Nagakiba and Keen Affinity with Blood Flame Blade. Now, the Nagakiba seems to even have more reach, and that's an interesting thing to note, because those that remember the Rivers of Blood at launch time, it had an insane amount of reach. It could actually reach on the Ash of War further than any katana in the game. But the reach of the weapon, the amount of bleed procs, and the damage as a whole has just been nerfed across the board. The Rivers of Blood between PvE and PvP, I believe, has had either 4 or 5 nerfs in total now. Sword of Night and Flame saw a bunch of nerfs, but then they buffed it. It actually had a period where it came back, and it now is, in my opinion, relevant again, especially for intelligence and faith builds. But as far as the Rivers of Blood itself, you can definitely feel that the weapon has been nerfed a ton since launch time. I tried the testing with these dragons multiple times, around 40 seconds for the Nagakiba with double slash and Keen Affinity, and over a minute each time for the Rivers of Blood. Now we're going to be testing with 80 in all damage stats. First, we'll take on a boss just so you can see it and kind of compare it to what you saw before, and then after that we're going to try the troll at Gatefront again, except this time we're going to use the starting katana in quality affinity because we're at a high level versus the Rivers of Blood, and we're going to see how that pans out. And then at the end, we'll end up taking on Mohg on New Game Plus 7 at rune level 150, and of course we'll show off the Rivers of Blood build along with good stats at rune level 150 that includes 60 Vigor as well. Here's the quality katana versus the Rivers of Blood. First up is the Rivers of Blood. I probably should have written that the other way, and we're going to see how much damage we get there, and then we're going to try out the starting katana. So around 7,500 damage in total, and I believe we ended up with 1 bleed proc. So the bleed procs are pretty comparable to both the Keen and the Quality Nagakiba. You actually get more bleed with Bloodflame Blade at around 85 bleed when you're using that with either the starting katana or the Nagakiba, because it's 40 plus 45. The Rivers of Blood giving us around 76 to 77, maybe 78 at most, somewhere around there. And the total damage ended up being 9,700, and the troll almost went down with one entire animation of double slash with Bloodflame Blade on the starting katana. Keep in mind, during this one for the max level 1 or the 80 and all damage stats, we did end up using buffs for both builds. We used Golden Vow, which remained active, even if you sit at a Site of Grace, I believe it stays active, and then we used Flame Grant Me Strength 2 on top of Bloodflame Blade in the tier. I tested pretty much multiple times with the trolls here, and every time the starting katana and quality affinity beat the Rivers of Blood. We were using Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and Bloodflame Blade for everything, and we were testing at Gatefront. We were only using the tier. I believe that's what we used for the trolls, but overall we kept the same exact buff, same exact setup for both, and it was beaten out every single time by a Keen katana. Or at higher levels, a quality katana, but either way, it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. The fact is that since they're the same animation, you're getting more bleed from it. Does it make the Rivers of Blood somewhat obsolete? Well, in a sense, kind of, yeah. And the other reason why I'd state that this is true is because of the fact that you can get the starting katana, obviously, and then as well as the Nagakiba relatively early in Eldenring, and double slash and Bloodflame Blade by the time you're in the lake, so you can have this build very early, and it does even more damage than the Rivers of Blood does, so in many ways, it's much better. It was higher at Gatefront, and it managed to take the dragons down. I believe I did that 5 times in total, and every single time it ended up winning with the Nagakiba, so that's pretty awesome to know that. Let's jump into equipment. For equipment, we have the Rivers of Blood plus 10. You can use the Dragon Communion Seal with this. We have the White Mask, Lord of Blood's Exaltation, Rotten Wing Sword Signia, Millicent's Prosthesis, Shard of Alexander, Thorny Tier, Fate Tier. Let's talk about stats. Now, the disadvantage at rune level 150 here is very obvious, and that is something that the Rivers of Blood does have. It does have split stats, essentially. You're going to need 45 Dexterity, 45 Arcane. We went for 60 Vigor. We were using Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength for our buffs. But launch Rivers of Blood wouldn't have mattered. You could have had 40 Dexterity, 45 Arcane, whatever, around those stats. It really wouldn't have mattered at all, and you still would have gotten 2 bleed procs with the Ash of War, an incredible amount of range, and a lot of damage. Overall, the double slash build beats the Rivers of Blood build. Keep in mind I had more footage, but on this channel, my side channel, I'm going to try to keep the content in general between 5 and 10 minutes. That's going to be the difference from my main channel. It's going to be a lot of shorter videos that kind of just hit our attention span, right? A little less long than some of my other stuff on my main channel, like the list videos and stuff. That being said, I did a lot more testing, and overall, every time, the Rivers of Blood lost. I hope this helped, and be sure to sub.